Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where we've seen a stunning series of developments and a rapid and very public deterioration of the White House's support for Ukraine. President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy are publicly trading barbs, with President Trump today lashing out at Ukraine's president, maligning Mr. Zelenskyy as a dictator without elections in a social media post filled with other falsehoods about the war, all echoing Russian talking points. It comes as the Trump administration is improving its relations with the Kremlin, including holding a meeting with Russian officials about Ukraine's future without Ukraine in the room. The dizzying episode leaving several of America's traditional allies stunned and grappling with how to respond. In addition to the falsely calling Zelenskyy a dictator, President Trump also claiming without evidence today that the Ukrainian people have soured on their leader and warning Zelenskyy that he, quote, better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. It comes after the president brazenly and falsely suggested that Ukraine started the war while also tacitly backing Putin's calls for regime change in Ukraine through new elections.
Russia wants to do something. They want to stop the savage barbarianism. I mean, what's going on over there? It's soldiers are being killed by the thousands on a weekly basis. It's ridiculous. And they're not American soldiers. They're Russian soldiers and they're Ukrainian soldiers largely. Today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. We have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine. Well, we have martial law, essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating, and where a country has been blown to smithereens.
Now, to be clear, it was Russia that launched the unprovoked illegal invasion of Ukraine almost 3 years ago that has devastated cities throughout the country, killing thousands of people and forcing millions to flee their homes. President Trump also claimed Russia wants to end the war, but the U.S. and Western intelligence suggests Putin is not interested in a peace deal and instead still wants control of all of Ukraine. President Zelenskyy today firing back at the president, accusing him of falling prey to Russian lies about the war and lies about his level of support among the Ukrainian people, telling reporters in Kyiv, quote, with all of my respect to President Trump, as a leader of the most respected people of America who supports us all the time, unfortunately lives in this disinformation space. Mr. Zelenskyy's sharpening of his rhetoric towards President Trump is a notable shift in tone compared to when I sat down with the Ukrainian president just a few days ago in Munich. Do you think President Trump is negotiating in good faith?
I hope so. I hope so. Yes, I count on it. I count on it very much.
Joining me now is NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, who is on the ground in Ukraine, and Peter Alexander, chief White House correspondent, is at the White House. Richard, let me start with you. Let's talk about how President Zelenskyy is responding to this intensifying rhetoric by President Trump. We're just getting some new reaction from him. What can you tell us?
So President Zelenskyy gives a daily address to the Ukrainian people. It is something that he started 3 years ago as the Russians were invading. And of course, as you said, it was Russia that launched this war. I was here. Russian troops came over the border. They started capturing Ukrainian territory. They did helicopter drops outside of Kyiv. They tried to take the capital. And one of the things that President Zelenskyy did was to try to communicate with the people frequently and directly. And he started posting on Telegram, he started posting on social media, on Facebook, any means possible so that he could show the Ukrainian people that he was still in the country and that the country still had a government. Well, he still does that even until this day, and he just gave his nightly address. And I will say, Kristen, he didn't bring up this dispute. He talked about how he hopes that there is pragmatism from the United States, and he called for the Ukrainian people to have unity and courage. So at least for now, he doesn't want to take this dispute even further. But it does not mean that this is over by any means. There is deep distrust now. There is deep fear among Ukrainians that President Trump and President Putin are allies and are meeting to try and divide up this country, and with little concern for what that means for the Ukrainians and their strategic interests.
Incredibly notable that he is choosing his words so carefully today, Richard. And of course, all of this does come as the U.S. Special Envoy Keith Kellogg is in Ukraine today. He's to some extent been cut out of the negotiations. He was not there in Russia. What are you watching for with this meeting, Richard?
Well, you said it yourself. There is a perception here, and I've been speaking to senior Ukrainian officials, that Kellogg is a second-tier envoy, that he is not of the same caliber, the same proximity to President Trump as his envoy Witkoff or Marco Rubio or the sort of full delegation that went to Russia, went to Saudi Arabia to negotiate with Russia. That he is here. The Ukrainians are hoping that they can bring him out to places like where I am in Kharkiv. They want to show him the battlefronts. They want to show him what they say is a different picture, and they're hoping that he'll take that message back to Washington and back to President Trump. We will see if that happens. So tomorrow is a very big day for the Ukrainians. They have an envoy. They don't think he's the most powerful envoy. They don't think he's as close to Trump as the team negotiating with Russia. But they do have someone from the administration who they are anxious to show around this country and try and change President Trump's mind on this.
And Richard, you were on the front lines. Tell us what you saw. What is the status of this conflict on the ground in terms of what you are seeing, your own reporting?
So for a lot of people in the United States, this may seem like a war of words, that you've got two big personalities. You've got President Zelenskyy, who has toured the world for the last 3 years and often been touted as a hero for staying here and holding this country together and standing up to Russia, fighting publicly with President Trump, who also has a very large personality and a big ego. But this is not just a clash of personalities for the people of Ukraine. And we were out on the front lines. You're seeing some of the soldiers we were with today. It was a tank unit. And those soldiers have been at that position for the last 3 years, almost without any breaks. And you can see how freezing cold it is. It's dangerous. There were drones in the area while we were there. They say that drone and Russian missile attacks are almost a constant reality, particularly on clear days like today when the drones have a full field of vision. It can see the Ukrainian troops. For them, this is a matter of life and death. They depend on the United States for support. They depend on the United States for political support, military support, weapons, ammunition. And now they're watching the President of the United States blaming them for the war and calling their president not just a dictator, but also a con man who's been conning the world, conning the United States, stealing billions of dollars, and saying that he has no approval rating in the country. He does not have a 4% approval rating. All the opinion polls here put him somewhere around 50%, 50 plus percent. So not perfect, but certainly not 4%.
Richard Engel, as always, thank you so much for your reporting on the ground there in Ukraine. Please continue to stay safe. We really appreciate it. Peter, let me turn to you at the White House. I know you've been talking to your sources throughout the day. What are you hearing about this intensifying rhetoric that we are seeing from President Trump towards Ukraine?
Well, we're hearing it and we're reading it in the form of multiple posts that President Trump has had about Volodymyr Zelenskyy, criticizing him, mocking him, maligning him, to use some of your language here. We did hear from the president's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, today, who is doing an interview with Fox News. He said, among other things, describing the relationship now strained between the U.S. and Ukraine. He said it's one that's frustrated right now, the U.S.'s view of it, one that's frustrated right now and clearly is going in the wrong direction. He said that frustration stems from, as he described it, bizarre pushback this week to the Trump administration's proposed deal to access Ukraine's rare earth minerals. If you're not aware of that, there have been conversations led by the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, where he was meeting with Ukrainians, effectively proposing, in exchange for all the money that the U.S. sent to Ukraine to support them, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in the form of military aid and other assistance, that the U.S. should have unique access to the rare earth minerals there that can be used for a variety of technological products. But the Ukrainians viewed that as sort of a one-sided deal, that they had nothing to gain by the offer that the White House was proposing to them. And Waltz also echoed the president's comments yesterday by questioning why President Zelenskyy himself has not tried to end this war, Kristen. So we're hearing similar sort of tough language, though with perhaps a little bit of context about why the president may be so fierce in the words he's using to describe a person who had, for the last several years, been a very close American ally.
Yeah, very different tone than what we saw coming from the former Biden administration, and also raises a lot of questions about how they will be able to bring these two sides together to negotiate a peace deal. And of course, all of this comes as there are questions, Peter, about whether President Trump will be meeting with President Putin. Both have signaled that they are willing to do so, but still no date on the table, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It really does sort of show you the 180 that's been made in terms of President Biden's departure and Donald Trump's arrival, right? Joe Biden, who had tried to ice out Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, who is effectively cozying up to him, saying he wants to meet with him, that it's good that we would have a good relationship. We don't know exactly when any meeting between the two would take place. It is worth noting that Steve Witkoff, who is one of the president's envoys initially to deal with the Middle East, now it appears to deal with affairs around the globe. He was in Moscow only a matter of days ago. He was there where he picked up Mark Fogel, the American school teacher who had been detained there for several years, brought him back home. Is our understanding that they had met, Putin did, with Witkoff for a matter of hours, the president indicating as much. So when does Putin come meet with the president? He said they'll go there to Moscow, and Putin will be invited here as well. And we'll wait to find out when. We
sure will. One of the threads that we are watching very closely, Peter, I know a lot of fast-moving developments around this. Thank you so much for your great reporting. Thanks, as always, I now want to bring in Ukrainian member of Parliament, Rudik. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I want to start with your reaction to what you have heard from Washington over these last 24 hours. The fact that President Trump has said that Ukraine started the war, calling President Zelenskyy a dictator. What's your response?
Hello, Kristen, and thank you so much for having me. I just want to mention that right now, while we are talking, Russia has launched just another attack on Kiev, and our air defense systems are working. And this is one of the signs that contradicts to what President Trump has said, that Russia wants to end the war, and of course, that Ukraine have started the war. It is very painful to hear it here in Ukraine. And especially it is painful to have to explain to people who are fighting at the front line, who have lost their loved ones at this war and who have paid an ultimate price, that someone is saying that Ukraine has started the war. And it just, as a politician, you never want to be in a position to talk to people who are fighting bravely and explaining to them why a president of the strongest democracy of this nation that has supported us so much can say something like this. I'm trying to explain that as a negotiation technique, but people here are hurt because, you know, we are surviving and fighting this war for more than 10 years right now. And the last 3 years, the full-scale invasion. And for people, it is very hard to be in this information noise, and it's not bringing to them any good feelings, I can tell you for sure.
Well, the broader question, in addition to all of this, is what does this potentially mean about negotiating a deal? We did see Trump officials in Saudi Arabia meeting with top Russian officials. Ukraine was not at the table. Trump administration officials who I've been speaking to say, look, we did meet with President Zelenskyy. Those meetings happened in Munich. But are you confident, or are you concerned, I should say, that a deal will be struck without Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine has proven that, well, it will be impossible, I say, to have a deal about Ukraine without Ukraine, because people will just simply not take it. We didn't take it when Russia wanted to conquer us, and we would absolutely not take it when somebody will try to pressure us into losing our sovereignty or territorial integrity without our will. And if there is something that we have shown the world over the last 3 years, is that we do not have this will. We did not capitulate in 2022, and we are not going to capitulate right now. And in 2022, our position was much weaker. And I can tell you, it was much more scary to be in Kiev those days when everybody believed that we will stand just for a couple of days. Right now, we are not alone. I strongly believe that we have many people from the United States who are holding our backs and who are supporting us. We have our European allies who promise not to leave us alone in this fight. So I'm very optimistic. However, we are very concerned that the United States started negotiating with terrorists. We thought that it was not your policy. Second, we are concerned that when we are discussing something, there are only talks about what Ukraine can forfeit or what Ukraine's red lines are. And we are not talking about the most important point, which is the security guarantees. How do we make sure that Russia would not attack us again? This is the key question. And as of right now, we have not heard any legitimate answer to this question. None. And so President Trump right now is questioning President Zelensky's legitimacy, but for some reason he is not questioning Putin's legitimacy, which the last Russian elections were not considered as fair by many European leaders. So this is, of course, right now we understand is happening because there is no clear understanding how to end the war. And I truly believe that US president has this in his mind, how to end it. However, it will not be a simple task, first and foremost, because Russia does not want to end the war. It's solely in their hands. They have started it, they can pull back their troops, and they can end it.
Let me ask you to respond to something that President Trump said yesterday. He's actually, this is Vice President Vance responding to Donald Trump saying there should be elections. He says, the idea that you cannot have elections in the midst of a war is, I think, kind of preposterous. And the president has made very clear that he thinks that should happen. So, you know, that is American policy. How do you interpret these calls for elections, and how do you explain to people who have that question, why can't you hold elections while there's a war raging?
Kristen, first and foremost, with all due respect, I need to say that neither Russian president nor American president will not be defining how Ukrainian people will be and when they will be electing our president. Second, regarding the elections during the martial law, it's according to our constitution that if the martial law is held, then there are no elections, and Parliament, which I am a member of, government and the president are continuing executing on their duties. And even if for some reason we would want to conduct that, there are a couple of major reasons why we cannot. The first and foremost is the security reason. Russia constantly is attacking us every single day, and not only at the front line, but the peaceful cities throughout Ukraine are under attack, and we do not have a proper way to protect people. Second, and very important topic is how do we make sure that our military are able to participate in this election, not only to exercise their right to vote, but also their right to be voted for. And this is impossible to do right now in the current situation when they are actively fighting at the battlefield. Third, we have 6 to 8 million people who are right now residing abroad, and they also should participate in the elections so they will be considered democratic.
Kira Rudik, thank you so much. We are sorry for all that you and your country have been through. Our condolences to you for the lives lost there. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kirsten, and glory to Ukraine.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.